When I first started this wonderful experience, I couldn't have ever guessed how meaningful it would be to me. I especially never would have guessed that one of my students would leave a note like this for me and Rebecca on our last day with them. In the beginning, I was so nervous, and the biggest question in my mind was how can I best help my students and maximize our time together? I found the answer to this question by identifying my two main goals for my time spent teaching my group. These were: identify where I can help my students and address those areas, and assess their growth over the course of our placement. Before I worked to identify my students' strengths and weaknesses, I thought back to my own math history. I remember how impactful it was to have teachers respect my individual thoughts and opinions and get to know me. Before every lesson, we shared our sunshine and cloud from the day with the group. My students loved the opportunity to talk about themselves and their lives, and I was given many valuable opportunities to listen to their attitudes and thoughts towards school and towards math. Conceptually, my students were fairly knowledgeable with place value, but I often found that their knowledge of vocabulary was not as strong as it needed to be. They struggled with foundational vocabulary, like addend and subtrahend. I addressed this by reviewing vocabulary at the start of every lesson. We made a game of it, but the students still received valuable practice with each of the words. Additionally, I ensured that I used all of the professional language necessary for each lesson. I believe it helped my students to hear me use the language in context and for them to practice using it as we worked together. I also found that my students worked best when they knew exactly what we were going to learn that day and how they were going to practice that skill. This is also tied to my goal to assess their growth throughout the time we spent together. I learned that they worked best when I told them exactly what we were going to be learning and how it would be demonstrated. Sometimes I even showed them a sample of the final product before we even began the lesson, and that helped motivate them to create something similar. By having them create an assessment artifact at the close of each lesson, I was able to see how effective my lesson was and how well they understood the concepts. I definitely discovered that my students had difficulty with staying focused in the small group setting. Initially, I found myself pausing the lesson and wasting valuable time to get them back on task. However, as time went on and my behavior expectations became clearer, I was able to correct their behavior in a very non-intrusive, efficient way. Every day, we reviewed our expectations until everyone knew them very well. Eventually, all it took to get my students back on task was a simple reminder to exhibit on-task behavior, which was represented by the O in our group behavior expectation poster. I was most impacted by the way my students' attitudes began to change over the course of the time we spent together. Because my lessons were meaningful and engaging, my students began to react very positively to what I was saying. I learned to have faith in myself, even with a subject that I have personally struggled with in the past. Just in my short time with my students, I answered my own question, and by setting those personal goals and working so hard to accomplish them, I learned how to make my lessons very relevant and suited to the needs of my group. I grew in my ability to address certain behaviors, as well as my ability to create meaningful, relevant lesson plans. In the future, I will keep what I learned in mind, that no two groups of students will be the same, just as no two students will be the same. In my future classroom, I will remember that it is so important that I create lessons that suit my students and make my objectives very well known to them at the start of the lesson. I experienced firsthand how making my objectives clear can set the tone for the entire lesson, and how well my students reach those objectives. Finally, I will remember how showing my students love and attention can help them grow and learn. Simply by showing interest in each student as an individual, I was able to express how important each of their opinions was to me, and they each grew to be very responsive and eager to share their thoughts. I am so thankful to AISD, Taylor Elementary, and the 3rd and 4th grade teachers for making this possible. All of my time spent with my students gave me such insight into what it is to be an elementary teacher and affirmed my decision to become one. I will always remember what I have learned through this experience and keep in mind this verse as I enter the world of teaching.